St. Francis wanted to go home for Christmas, not to Assisi, where he'd been born and raised, for Francis knew that world was forever past and lost to him. And now God's little poor man was on the road all the time, preaching and teaching with the friars who were his companions. Oh, but Francis still longed for a Christmas feast, for grandparents and grandchildren gathered around the table for a meal, gathered around the fire for warmth and stories. Francis remembered all of that from his childhood in Assisi long ago. But Francis could not go back to the past, and Assisi was no longer the childhood home of his memories. But if there was any place that was most home to Francis, it was the little village of Greccio, halfway between Assisi and Rome. Greccio was tucked high up in the mountains and surrounded by thick forests. The people of Greccio were simple and honest and full of love for Francis. Now in Greccio there lived a nobleman, Count Giovanni, who was a wealthy, generous, and just man. He owned the mountain, the forest, and the valley below. And he was a close friend of Francis. And so Francis asked Giovanni to help him prepare for a different kind of Christmas this year. Oh, Giovanni was honored. Of course, he would have a great feast. But then he heard the details of Francis' request. Francis asked, Giovanni, will you prepare one of your stables for the celebration of Mass on Christmas Eve? Francis asked, will you bring live animals into the barn for the liturgy? And Francis asked, will you invite the shepherds and woodcutters and farmers from the village of Greccio? And finally, Francis asked, will you prepare a feeding trough with clean hay and place it next to the altar? Now in those days, Christmas had always been a most serious and solemn event, done with great pomp. So Giovanni wondered how Francis could want the whole village to come to an old stable to celebrate. But when Francis arrived on the day of Christmas Eve with a few of his friars, they found that all had been made ready by one of Giovanni's servants. Francis went deep into the woods to pray, and Giovanni returned to his castle, and with his wife and children eagerly prepared for Christmas Eve. As darkness fell, the Count and Countess stood outside on their castle tower and looked over the valley. Oh, it was a harsh landscape, but it was their home. Not many important people passed this way, but the villagers and the farmers and all the people in the valley were good neighbors to Giovanni and his family. In fact, the whole mountainside and valley seemed to belong to one big family. The day was short, and the sky was full of dark clouds. And as the lights faded, snow began to fall, large flakes drifting down like feathers in the cold night air. And then the Count and Countess saw dozens and dozens of lights, torches burning brightly, held by the farmers, shepherds, and woodcutters as they made their way from every corner of the valley to the little stable. The Countess said, oh, the Magi saw only one star, but we see hundreds of stars burning brightly in everyone's heart as they make their way to our stable this night. Oh, I'm so glad we are not in some palace in Rome. I am glad we are home for Christmas. Since Francis was a deacon, he could sing and preach at Mass. Francis sang and preached in the stable. He spoke of Jesus, the God of glory, who humbled himself to be born of a poor peasant woman in a stable. He spoke of the King of glory. Come to the shepherds, come to the poor, come to all who open their hearts to him. After the Mass was over, everyone's attention turned toward the procession that went from the stable up to the castle. Everyone's thoughts turned toward the great feast that the Count and Countess had prepared. And everyone's eyes turned away from the altar and the manger. But Giovanni turned and looked at the manger again. And this time he saw a little baby asleep in the manger on a bed of hay. And he saw Francis step toward the manger, reach in and softly awaken the sleeping child. Now, whether others saw what Giovanni saw, he did not know, but he saw it and he understood. He whispered to himself, "My friend Francesco is awakening the Christ child in each of us tonight, the child that has been asleep for so many years." Giovanni knew that Christmas would no longer be formal and solemn. Christmas would now be simple and tender. Francis and his friars shared a great feast in Giovanni's castle that night. The rich and the poor were all there, all grandparents and little children. Poor woodsman in the rags and the Count and his finery. Oh, there were many differences that night, but the differences didn't matter. Francis knew that he was home for Christmas. Now, every year, Giovanni and his family prepare their hearts for Christmas. They open the door to their hearts that the Christ child might come in. And there in our hearts, the Christ child sleeps. He rests until he awakens with us on Christmas morning.